Have you ever heard that all U.S. Army soldiers are in like amazing, great shape and really physically fit? Well, that could technically be a stereotype. And there's a lot of stereotypes out there about Army soldiers, and I wanted to provide you with some examples of a handful of them. Some are good, some are bad stereotypes, and give you a little bit of truth behind them. Are they true? Is that a real thing, or is it just a stereotype that someone makes up about them? I would say that probably all of these have some level of truth and some level of it being false, I guess. It really depends sometimes, but I want to clarify that. I want to give you some of these stereotypes, and maybe you can provide me with some down in the comment section down below, but nonetheless, here are some stereotypes about the United States Army soldiers and whether or not they are true. So the first one is related to that first thing I was talking about, is that they're all physically fit. They're all in great shape. And for the most part, I will say yes. There are soldiers that are not in good shape, right? But I would say the majority are in good shape. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One being that you're commonly having to do physical fitness, especially you're on active duty, right? You know, if you're in the Reserves and National Guard, it's kind of on you. So you probably have a higher chance of not being physically fit if you're in the Reserves and National Guard, because there's nobody making you do physical fitness like they are doing on active duty. But if you're on active duty, yeah, it's probably a much higher percentage that you're gonna be physically fit, because every morning, or pretty much every morning on active duty, you're doing physical fitness, whether that's with your squad, your platoon, your company, whatever, you're doing that fitness, right? And then you have that fitness test you have to do at least every 6 months. And especially on active duty, you might do that more often than that or whatever. We're on the Reserves and National Guard side, maybe a little bit less often type of thing. You're still supposed to do it every 6 months, but there's a lot of times where those units kind of walk a thin line and kind of get away with going a little bit longer, or something else kind of is going on. But on active duty, yeah, the percentage of soldiers that are on active duty are more likely going to be pretty well fit, but still not 100%, right? Not every single one is going to be. You're going to have situations where soldiers are out of shape because they're not putting forth a lot of effort in physical fitness. They're eating like crap and they don't have the metabolism to kind of keep up with that. And then that ends up happening. And then if that happens and they can't pass the fitness test, well, then they kind of end up having to do remedial PT, which means they have to do extra physical fitness, after duty hours or during the middle of the day, or whatever they're kind of working in there to try to get them back into shape. And then if after several attempts of trying to get them back into shape to pass the fitness test and they still can't, they could possibly get chaptered out. I don't feel like that's very common, but it can happen. But sure, I will say that the majority, especially on active duty, are in great shape. The people that you see that sometimes in like some of these memes or some of this other stuff online, most of those people could be like Reserves and National Guard, because they're not held to the same standard, quite the same. I mean, they are as far as the fitness test, but they're not doing physical fitness as often as like the active duty guys and girls. But there are people on active duty that are also in pretty poor shape and just end up letting themselves go and don't put forth a lot of effort. So majority of people are in pretty good shape. Another one is that they're all alcoholics. That one's a common one that I've heard a bunch of times too. That one, I don't really know what the percentage is, but it's probably not a good percentage, but there are some. There are obviously alcoholics on the civilian side too, but the thing with it in the Army is that, especially like with single soldiers in the barracks, they don't have a whole lot to do sometimes. And partying is one of the big popular things to do, which can lead to that stereotype and being true that you have a lot of soldiers that are alcoholics, because that's what they're doing, especially when you're early in the Army and you're just experiencing life away from your family, from your parents, living under the roof of your mom and dad, kind of a structure. You're going to go pretty crazy, and you're probably going to want to go and party and do all this fun stuff that you heard about and you heard stories about and you've seen on TV or whatever. And that sometimes for some individuals does lead to becoming alcoholics. And then they end up drinking every single weekend, drinking all the time type of thing. Now, I don't think the percentage is really high, but there's probably enough that it's a problem, right? And a part of that just goes back to, especially when new soldiers, you don't have a whole lot to do. You're just kind of get caught up in the moment of wanting to party with all the other soldiers and barracks parties and all sorts of craziness, and it leads to alcoholism, right? I've seen a lot of soldiers that I've known that definitely were like that, where every day they're having something to drink, maybe every weekend, whatever the case was. Maybe they kind of recover from later on and kind of realize what it's doing to their body or doing to their relationships or whatever, and then they get out of it. And then some people just kind of get stuck with it, and it causes bigger problems in the end. So this stereotype, I won't say is like all soldiers. It's definitely not all soldiers, but there is probably a a worrisome percentage of people, especially like new soldiers. For some of the more seasoned, soldiers, maybe the percentage starts to lower, but some of your younger soldiers that are kind of like first experience in this, probably a little bit of a higher percentage, I would think, in my opinion, right? The actual percentage in facts, I don't know, but not all soldiers are alcoholics, but there's probably a worrisome percentage of them. Have you ever heard that all soldiers in the United States Army are really good with firearms? Well, that one, there's probably a pretty good percentage of that, I will say, because the reason for it is just leading to the amount of experience that you get with firearms. You have to do weapons qualification, right? Let's say you're a basic soldier. Even if that soldier is a cook, that soldier is working in human resources type of thing, they still have the basics on active duty at least. Well, even on the Reserves National Guard, just not as frequent. But on active duty, let's say, for example, right, that they're going to have to go to the weapons qualification range every 6 months. And there's going to be some training leading up to that, right? You're going to have to go and qualify with your weapon. You're going to have to do some stuff. And for some civilian individuals, they don't get any weapons training. Maybe they're gun enthusiasts. They get like a crap ton of weapons training because that's what they're doing every single weekend type of thing. But, in the Army, right, there's going to be individuals that, still suck with weapons because they're just don't grasp the concept. They don't know the fundamentals of like weapons marksmanship and certain kind of, what do they call it, a BRM, basic rifle marksmanship, right? So they don't grasp that concept and still, struggle to qualify and have to, do additional attempts to try to qualify. But I will say it is pretty high, right? Because, you have to do weapons cleaning a lot. You're going to have to take that thing apart and put it back together. So you get kind of fluent with, at least for the M4, right? How to take it apart and put it back together. And then you're going weapons qualification ranges, and there's definitely certain MOSs that get a lot more experience with weapons, like 11 Bravos and certain other MOSs that are constantly going to the field and doing weapons training, and they probably become a little bit more fluent with how to use weapons and how to fire them and how to do maintenance on them and all sorts of stuff. But it's still going back to a lot of this stuff. It's not every soldier, right? There's going to be definitely some soldiers that are not very good, especially you get, let's say, some human resources, right? They may go and do a little bit of training here and there. They do weapons qualification, but then you take some civilian who is a gun enthusiast going every single weekend, going hunting all the time type of thing. That enthusiast might be better than that soldier is. So there's definitely some civilians that are better with weapons than soldiers, but then there's definitely some soldiers that are way better than some of those civilians, especially like special forces, some of those 11 Bravos that are doing weapons training all the time. So, it definitely varies. I mean, even probably on the 11 Bravo side, right? There's probably some infantry soldiers that suck with weapons because they're not paying attention or not really into it or not just grasping the concept. But I will say a higher percentage. There's a pretty good percentage of soldiers in the Army that are probably pretty good with weapons. Not saying they all could be snipers, but they're probably pretty damn good with weapons compared to a lot of your average civilians that are not gun enthusiasts. Ladies, I know you're a very small percentage of my audience type of thing, but you've probably heard that don't date a soldier in the Army because they'll cheat on you. And that's another stereotype, that all soldiers in the Army, male or female, are cheaters, and they're probably going to cheat on you. There is some truth behind that, right? But this one is kind of one of those things where there are a lot of civilians that are like this too, because, depending on if you have a job that's kind of similar to the military, where it's taking you away from, those relationships because you have to go to the field, you have to go on deployments, you have a civilian job that's kind of similar to that, where maybe you have to travel a lot for work. And those people, if they are already in that mentality of, really dependent on that physical contact in a relationship, now they're away from that person they normally get that physical contact from, and they're looking to get it from someone else while they're away from that person, right? On either side, military or civilian side, they're probably going to cheat on that person that they're with. So that one, I don't know if it's like a higher percentage with Army or military or what, because you're going to get those individuals that if they're in that kind of environment, even on the civilian side, because they have to travel a lot for work, and they're that kind of person where they're really dependent on that physical contact with another individual, and they can't get that physical contact that they normally get from their relationship, they may go to other people. So I would say cheaters, it's a thing that kind of is pretty equal, where people on the civilian side and military side that are away from those people are probably going to do that stuff, right? Not to say, like I said, all soldiers or all civilians or whatever in that kind of environment are always going to cheat on you, right? You got to kind of like build that relationship. That's why I always say that, sometimes those field problems, stuff like that, really kind of show what kind of relationship you have, whether it's with that soldier or that civilian, right? Because even a soldier could go off to a deployment, could go off to the field for a month, and that civilian that they're in a relationship with is one of those individuals that needs that physical contact. And because they're not getting it from the person they're in a relationship with, they go find it somewhere else and they end up cheating. And that's a lot of the stories where you have like Jody and everything that you get from being in the Army that you hear about is coming from those kinds of things. So that one's kind of like on both sides, right? If you're just that person and that kind of mentality, you're probably going to end up cheating on that person you're in a relationship with, type of thing. I don't think it's a thing where specifically soldiers, because they're soldiers, are always going to cheat on you. It's that person that's that kind of a person where they need that physical contact. And if they're not getting that physical contact from you in their relationship, then yeah, they're probably going to do it whether they were in a civilian job or in the military. So that one, just being a soldier, isn't going to make you being a cheater. It's that person and that personality of how they are that makes them a cheater. Have you heard that all soldiers in the Army are very well disciplined? That one, for the most part, for that one, it definitely comes down to some of the circumstances, right? Because of the structure, especially when you're on active duty, of having to stand a certain way for like officers and non-commissioned officers, saluting, addressing people a certain way, right? That builds discipline in some people. But there are definitely some people where they only have that discipline when they're talking to those individuals, right? They're talking to their first sergeant, they're talking to their platoon sergeant, they're talking to their company commander, and they're showing a lot of discipline. But you go and you catch them outside of the work environment, you know, they're in Walmart, they're in McDonald's or whatever, and they're not very disciplined. They're like, screw you. You're not my platoon sergeant. You're not my company commander. I can talk to you how I feel like talking to you. So that one is kind of iffy. It definitely probably does instill some different values on people to where they may become more disciplined than they were previously to the Army. But depending on the person, you'll definitely see some people where maybe it does carry over, right? They're really well disciplined in their job and disciplined around their platoon sergeant, first sergeant, whoever type of thing. And they carry that over with them when they're talking to other people outside of work, right? They're at Walmart, whatever, they're out in the public and stuff like that. And you still kind of see that discipline kind of coming across to you. And then there's other people that are only really well disciplined because of the first sergeant and the consequences of not being very well disciplined at your platoon sergeant, your company commander. And they're like, I'm sick of being well disciplined around those individuals. Screw it. I'm going to go crazy when I'm around all these civilians and these other people, and I'm not going to be the same way. So it definitely kind of varies. And there's even people that aren't very well disciplined to their platoon sergeant or commander because they're just not that kind of individual. And then that causes some problems and, you know, possibly them getting in trouble and all sorts of other things. But I won't say that, you know, everyone is really well disciplined. It kind of has these moments, but probably more disciplined than they were before they joined the Army. But there's also some civilians that because of their job, they become pretty well disciplined, right? On law enforcement, maybe firefighters type of thing. Depends on the career path and what they're kind of doing. But yeah, I mean, I will say that, you know, to a certain degree, a lot of soldiers are well disciplined, some more disciplined than others, some very little, only a little bit more disciplined than maybe you are, who's not in the military. So to some degree, I will say that all soldiers are pretty well disciplined, whether that's only a little bit or a lot. So how about one last one? And before I get into the last one, if you want to help support the channel, all right, there's a shirt. You may not have been able to see it very well in this video, but I got a lot of shirts that I sell on my website. There'll be a link down in the description box down below. Making sure you're subscribed is always a good free one you can do. You can also become a member of Chaos Elite and get some extra perks like early access to videos. But we'll get into one last one. One last one that I actually hear pretty commonly of a stereotype, and that is that all soldiers have PTSD. Now, you may have already guessed it, but that one's not really true. There are a lot of soldiers that do have PTSD, and that sucks. It's really horrible. And it definitely depends on like when that person served in the military, right? Probably a lot of your modern day soldiers, let's say soldiers that recently joined within the last few years, maybe even, let's say back in 2017, maybe even, right? Probably a much lower percentage. There are soldiers that do experience like combat still and kind of have certain environments, not even just combat, right? There are other things that can cause a soldier to have PTSD other than simply going to a combat zone. But I feel like the percentage is much lower. The higher percentage of soldiers that are the higher chance of having some PTSD is probably your individuals that were in the Army during Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom for Iraq and Afghanistan. Those soldiers probably have a higher chance. And even not just combat soldiers, it could be other soldiers as well, because there are other kind of circumstances that can happen where a soldier, let's say that's a truck driver especially, right? Or maybe even a mechanic or whatever, was out on mission and they got ambushed or something went south. Or I've even known some soldiers that have developed PTSD because of something that happened to somebody else, right? You have a really close friend, maybe even a loved one that is on deployment with you, you're in a relationship with that person, and they got killed in some way, right? And you got PTSD because of that. So those individuals that were probably during those deployments, probably higher chances of possibly having PTSD, but not guaranteed. Not everybody that deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan has PTSD, right? But some of your modern ones, probably a smaller percentage because of the lower chance of them being in that kind of situation in a combat zone especially. But I've seen some soldiers that have PTSD outside of being deployed to a combat zone. Something happened during a training event, something happened back at their unit, right? PTSD is just post-traumatic, stress syndrome or whatever, right? So that can come in many different forms. A lot of people think that in order to get PTSD, it had to be because you were in Iraq, Afghanistan, you were in war. PTSD can come from all sorts of things, right? And so everybody having it, no, right? Not every soldier has some kind of mental issues or going to end up homeless or have PTSD. But even some soldiers that I know have PTSD because they were in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're not quite the level of like the stereotype, right? The stereotype is that, oh my God, this person has crazy flashbacks and they curl up in a ball and they're going to try to kill people. They're going to start fights and stuff like that. No, there's just some soldiers that I know that have PTSD that are not at that extreme level, but there's definitely things that, make them uncomfortable, right? They're in an environment and it triggers some kind of memory or just a feeling. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to just go off the rails and get all crazy, but maybe they're now uncomfortable and they don't want to be there, right? Maybe it's like something as simple as going to a concert, right? They go to a concert and they're around a bunch of crowds and they have a hard time with that crowd. They're not going to all of a sudden just freak out and try to start killing everybody in that crowd, but maybe they're very uncomfortable being around that crowd, and which makes it hard for them to enjoy being at that concert and being there. And they don't want to be there. They're not enjoying the concert. They would rather leave and go back home type of thing, get out of that environment. And that's not at that same extreme level like the stereotype might be, thinking they're like, oh, they're just violent because they have PTSD. They want to, hurt people because they have PTSD. They're going to start freaking out and start hallucinating like they're back in war because they have PTSD. No, it's not quite like that. There's different levels of PTSD and different types of kind of people that have different kind of, ways they kind of deal with it and kind of react to certain things. But nonetheless, back to the stereotype of all soldiers have PTSD. No, there's definitely some soldiers that probably have a higher percentage of possibly having that PTSD, but not everybody. Now, what's some stereotypes that maybe you've heard? Maybe you've heard them on the internet. You've heard them from other individuals that have talked to you about being in the military or in the army. I want to hear down in the comment section down below, what are some stereotypes about soldiers or maybe just even military individuals in general that you've heard? And maybe I can elaborate if it's true or not true, or other people watching this video can reply to your comment and kind of give their opinion on that. But I want to hear from that down in the comment section down below, because like another one that I didn't mention in this video, it's not maybe a really huge common one, but I remember like after I got done with basic training and I went back to visit my friends and family back home, a lot of my friends just automatically assumed that I could fight really well or that I was really tough because they would try to like mess with me, and they just assumed that all of a sudden I'm a ninja now and I can do karate, I guess, and I know all this crazy like fighting moves and I'm super tough. And I was like, no, they taught us a few things in basic training, nothing to make us a black belt or anything crazy, but there was some things that maybe toughened you up a little bit, but not to the level of what they thought. They thought that I was like some hardcore badass now because I went through Army basic training and stuff like that. So that's an example of one of the ones that I remember from my friends of a stereotype. But nonetheless, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, and make sure you're hitting that thumbs up because YouTube algorithm loves that. Leave a comment, even if it's just say hi, Chris. I don't mind, right? Support the channel. Make sure you're subscribed. Purchase some merch through my website down below and all sorts of fun stuff. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Christopher Chaos, and I'll see you next time. See ya.